So let's look at, we'll take this apart philosophically, right? We'll do this in the Socratic manner. It's like, so if we're talking about mental illness, we should start by talking about illness. Well, what is illness? Well, on the left-hand side, there's a square there. You can't see it very well. Illness. What's illness related to? Pathogen, that might be the simplest explanation, although you're so full of bacteria that it's absolutely ridiculous. So that's a kind of, you actually have about 10 times more bacteria in your body by number than you do human cells. So the mere, yeah, I know it's a terrible thought, but but you know, the mere presence of pathogens doesn't indicate illness, but some illnesses are accompanied by, you know, an exceptional overload of a certain kind of pathogen. Those are illnesses that are pretty easy to identify in some ways or to conceptualize. So that's one potential marker of an illness. You're colonized by some parasitical organism. Another marker we use for illness is suffering, right? We generally presume two things. We assume that if you're suffering, there's probably something wrong with you, or if you're really making other people suffer, there's probably something wrong with you too. And there's a subset of those two occurrences that we might regard as characterized by illness, although we tend not to think that every form of suffering is an illness. Although in the DSM, bereavement, I believe now is just defined as a psychiatric disorder. And there's some, you know, there's some utility in that, and it's understandable, even though you could make a case against it. So suffering matters. So we tend to think that there's something wrong with undue pain and anxiety. Maybe undue disgust. Mostly it's associated with negative emotion, right? We don't like too much negative emotion. But now and then we also consider too much positive emotion pathological. So that's what happens, for example, in the case of mania. So the excessive domination by an emotional state, mostly suffering, but not always, is one of the criteria by which we might judge illness. Then there's another one, which you might think of as functional interference. There was a special journal of the Journal of Abnormal Psychology published quite a while ago now, about 15 years, that was devoted to conceptualizations of mental illness. And the paper that probably had the most impact in that journal was, and I unfortunately can't remember the name of the author, he claimed that a system was pathological if it was no longer performing its biologically designed function. And, you know, that's stupid, because things don't have biologically designed functions, because biology doesn't design functions, right? It's not teleological. You can attribute a function to a biological system, but you have to do that. You're inferring it. But he was still on, like, what function does your hand have, right? What function does your tongue have? It's not easy to figure these things out, because there are multiple functions, and some of them seem good and some of them bad. You can't skirt the issue by pointing to evolution and using it as your whipping boy for poor philosophy. So, well, people do that all the time. When they don't want to think something through, they blame it on evolution. It's not helpful. It's not helpful. Now, but the idea of functional interference is helpful, but you gotta understand that your moral judgment plays a role as soon as you make those functional inferences. So what you have to do is specify what you believe to be the goal of a given system, and then define what you consider unacceptable deviance from the pursuit of that goal. And we do that a variety of ways. We allow individuals to do that. So they might come in and say, I want to do X, but this is happening and I can't, and that's making me suffer. And so you think, okay, you've got a psychological problem. Or maybe a family brings in their 12-year-old daughter, 12-year-old son, who's, you know, causing a tremendous amount of problem at school, and they say, well, you know, we can't control our son, and so we believe there's something wrong with him. And so then you assume that the family's making some sort of reasonable judgment about the appropriate goals of their son plus the family. Then we allow society to do this, because normally you can't rob a bank, right? And, you know, maybe we consider that criminal, but under some circumstances we might also consider it a form of illness. And we do a very bad job of differentiating between those, because childhood conduct disorder and antisocial personality disorder are both medical syndromes, but you can't segregate them from criminal behavior with any ease whatsoever. So that's a very, very messy and loose category. But the point is that we allow systems at different levels of analysis to specify their goals, and then engage in a collaborative discussion about what constitutes unacceptable deviations from the pursuit of those goals. And we might combine those, you know, and we say, well, if you're happy, even if you're failing, well, then you don't have a mental illness. But if you're failing to pursue your goals and that's causing you suffering, that's even more indication that something has gone wrong. Now, you can see right off the bat that's a real vicious problem from a scientific perspective, because as soon as you start to define a goal as valid rather than just as a goal, then you're into ethics and not into science, because valid is a proxy for something like good, right? So, and people don't like to do that, because as soon as they're in the ethical domain, they're not in the scientific domain, and then they can't think of themselves as scientists, and everything gets complicated. So, okay, now we'll flip from illness, we'll talk about health. Health is equally problematic, obviously. I'm sure somebody's already talked about normative function, right? I could define you as healthy insofar as you're near the midpoint on some normal distribution, right? And then maybe you could think about health as attempting to tap people towards that midpoint. Most of that's rubbish too, fundamentally, because at least in terms of an overarching theory, and maybe we can't have a theory of mental illness. Maybe we have to have 6 theories. You know, theories are tools anyway, so that doesn't bother me too much. But assuming we're trying to come up with a theory, normative doesn't work. First of all, if you look at trait personality, there's a normal distribution. Well, the distribution is a normal distribution, not because the midpoint is normal, but because the normal distribution is normal. And so you're normal wherever you are on that distribution. It's just that there aren't necessarily that many of you. And so, you know, we might object to someone who's pretty high in predatory aggression, which would make them low in agreeableness from a trait perspective, because, you know, they're not that kind. But, you know, if your tribe is being attacked, you probably want to have some predatory aggressors in your little group, because otherwise you'll get slaughtered. And so, you know, maybe you might think then that the sanity issue is a matter of fit between temperament and situation, rather than, you know, temperamental deviation per se. You know, and you might think that empathy and sympathy and all those things are good, but if you are a fan of Freud's Oedipal theory, the first thing you realize, if you know anything about trait theory, is that Oedipal families are characterized by at least one parent who is way too sympathetic and empathetic, right? They don't set any limits and they forgive everything, and that's pathological beyond belief. You can kill people with excess kindness just like you can kill them with excess aggression. So the normative argument doesn't work. Plus, we think more intelligence is better, and we think more beautiful or more symmetrical is better. And so a lot of the times when we're talking about health, normative doesn't work, because we actually have a scale that goes from bad to good rather than from, you know, abnormal to normal to abnormal, which is what a normal distribution does. So we're not going to get out of the issue that way. And then, you know, most of the time too, when we are talking about health per se, we do have a kind of ideal in mind, right? And that ideal would be the healthy person. And that pops up all the time in psychopathology, abnormal psychology, and in psychology. As soon as it disappears, someone reinstates it. So, you know, Freud maybe concentrated on psychopathology to a large degree. Jung, by contrast, concentrated on individuation, which was a form of moral development as a marker of mental health. The biomedical people, and I guess that really got its start probably started mostly in the 50s or the 40s, probably partly because of the medicalization of psychiatry, but also partly because of the behavioral movement. And that was sort of characterized as another concentration of psychopathology as something like biological dysfunction, brain disorder, or maybe neurotransmitter malfunction. But at the same time that was happening, you had the existential psychotherapists who concentrated on authentic existence as a marker of health. And then after that, you had the humanists and in the 1960s, and the phenomenologists who also concentrated on something like truth and authenticity as a marker of health. And then more recently, you have the positive psychologists who are deluded enough to believe that happiness is a hallmark of mental health, which has got to be the stupidest theory that's come out in the last, I would say, probably 2,000 years. So, and they, and just to put the knife in a little deeper, they haven't read any of the existentialists or the humanists or anybody in the last 100 years who talked about, optimal functioning as a marker of mental health, and feel that they've invented the concept themselves, which is appalling beyond belief. But anyways, the point is that, there's always been a tension between the definition of pathology as something like medical malfunction and the conceptualization of health as an ideal that's on the other end of that also has something to do with moral endeavor in one form or another. And I actually think that the morality element of that is difficult to conceptualize from a scientific perspective, but just because it's difficult doesn't mean it's impossible. And I think there has been some interesting move in that direction by people like Piaget, because Piaget had a pretty good conceptualization of the ideal state as something that you could describe technically at the level of systems interaction. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that later. Point here is that you can't make this a simple question by talking about illness or by talking about health, because you run into the same sorts of problems at both ends of the definitional spectrum.